Lisa,
Yes, baby girl.
when I grow up, I want to be a menace to society.
Then so shall you be. Hey, this is Lisa Landry. Welcome back to A Menace to Society. I'm extremely excited about today's guest. I'm not even sure how to introduce him to y'all because he's pretty much a Renaissance man. Please welcome to the podcast, George Gimarc.
Hey, what's up, Lisa? Nice to hear from you again.
It's a pleasure. You know, I adore you. You're one of my favorite people that I've come into contact with in entertainment because you're just a cool, present, real dude with killer stories because you've done it all.
Well, I've been behind the scenes, but I've been on the scene for a lot of pretty fun stuff.
Uh-huh.
I've been in the radio business for, since 1975, for crying out loud, which put me in the periphery of the music industry. I've actually run a record label. I've run a performing rights organization. I've run a radio network. I've written books, worked in TV, hung out with scads of punk rock and new wave folks over several decades. It's a fun existence when you don't have to actually show up at the hardware store.
But when do you find time for church?
Well, the church of music.
Yeah,
Whatever.
music. You know a lot about music. I know that you did a lot of journaling for great articles and interviews of massive musicians all around the world.
Yeah, I love it. Music is really uplifting, and I mean that's a very old-fashioned word, uplifting. But it lightens your heart and it sets you in a better mood. And I like music that is uplifting and fun and silly. I have a profound silly side, which is why I guess I'm so deeply immersed in comedy these days.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense as a transition, right? Music to comedy because it's all about rhythm and personality.
Well, there's a friend of mine who said something to me ages ago when after being in the new wave in the punk rock world for years, I mean from 1975 to about 1995, I got into talk radio, and then I eventually 10 years ago got into doing comedy, running a bunch of comedy radio stations. And I told him that I felt really, really at home in comedy. And I mean, I've been a fan of comedy since I was a kid, but I said I feel really at home as a broadcaster in comedy with working with comedians. And he said, well, you're in the same business you've always been in. And I said, you're gonna have to explain that. And he says, okay, you're performers. What size rooms do they work? And I said, they're working like 75, 150. If they're doing really well, they're playing 300 or 400. A few theaters, and then a very, very few are playing to 3,000 or more. He said, okay. And they're all on major labels? And I went, oh, God, no. Mostly indie releases, most of them. A large label would be like, Comedy Central, and truth be told, that's a minor label in the grand scheme of things. He said, okay. And they're pretty normal folks. And I went, oh, man, they are the canaries in the social coal mine. And get a lot of people with some borderline social disorders. And he said, you're in the same business. They just don't have instruments. So it's like, yeah, that is kind of the punk rock ethos, but without instruments. So, okay,
I think
still
that's
in the
fair.
same business.
Yeah, that's a totally fair comparison, Makes total sense.
It's interesting because I've actually talked to some comedians about this, quite a few, and it's fascinating to me how many comics, that's their music palette. That's where they come from, is they love, whatever it is, Social Distortion and The Clash and all of that is where they live musically, and then they do comedy. And I think there's a natural pairing between these two arts. And the whole punk rock new wave thing, when it was happening, a lot of it had an enormous sense of silly humor to it. I mean, The Damned was a silly band. Devo was a very silly band. Now, they had political messages buried in there, but they were delivering it with a really good sense of humor, kind of like comedy.
Tell me more about Devo, because the last time you and I spoke, you were letting me know a lot about their back history.
Oh, God, Devo's fascinating because a lot of us At the time, our first exposure was Devo was when they showed up on Saturday Night Live and did this completely deconstructed version of Satisfaction, and it was just like, oh my God, what the hell was this? But that was like in 1977. Devo had actually gotten together. Several of the guys went to Kent State. They were there in '69, and they were starting to fiddle around with the whole notions of de-evolution and what have you, and put the rudiments of the band together in like 72, 73. And they were already, knocking out basement tapes. Now, a lot of these have already, they've come out since. There have been some little small releases where you get to hear these noodlings they did as students. But 72, 3, 4, they were creating songs that were not that dissimilar to what we heard when they put out their first album. I think that's fascinating stuff. There was a lot of frustration in the established music of that era especially, it really came to a head in 1975, 76. So there were quite a few people already fiddling in the basement working on the next thing. And that was part of the reason why I wrote the book Punk Diary. This massive tome which takes you from 1970 to 1982, day by day by day, showing you this is how it came to pass. And there's a lot of gray space. Punk did not happen at a moment, at a festival, at a concert, at a day and time. It kind of grew. It happened over a period of about 6 years.
Yeah, there was an evolution, and I was surprised, and I didn't know until you educated me. And I love all the music you're speaking about. I love those bands. I had no idea that punk really started in Ohio. I knew that there were great musicians in Ohio that were part of that wave, but I thought it was, the British bands that kind of originated this. I had no idea.
Yeah, there's a lot of folks that like to hang it all on the Sex Pistols and the Clash and all that. But, there were a couple hot spots in America. One, of course, would be in San Francisco. The other's up in Ohio. And then there's in New York, down in Manhattan. And out in Ohio, that's where you get the Dead Boys, you get Devo, you get Perubu. Perubu is a fascinating group. Perubu was kind of an Ohio version of, a little more extreme version of the Talking Heads. Art school guys who were really wanting to do something totally different. And out in San Francisco, it was a different flavor. And in New York, it was a totally different flavor. But all these scenes were kind of really starting to bubble up in small local scenes in 75, 76. There was, at the time, when I got to college in the fall of 75, I met up with a guy who was also what we would probably, Lisa, you and I probably refer to as a musical deviant, because we were definitely not down with what was going on. And he started introducing me to some different music like reggae and some German electronic stuff. And we would read in these music magazines like the New York Rocker and what have you, about the scene that was happening, this punk rock scene. And at the time, punk rock referred to garage bands from the 60s, like the Seeds or the Music Machine. That was called record collectors. We referred to that as punk rock. So when we would read about there's this punk rock thing going in these little clubs in these cities, we go, oh, that's interesting. There's a garage band revival, 10 years after the fact, they're reviving this garage band sound. Well, yes and no. There would be an ad in the back of the paper, these little box ads, where it would say, Perubu, 30 seconds over Tokyo, mail away for our single for $1.29. Right to David Thomas, P.O. Box, So we'd stick a $5 bill in an envelope and order a couple copies of the single. And we started getting these incredibly bizarre records in the mail. And we would get them from Devo, and we got them from Perubu, and we got them from television. We just thought these things were just wondrously funny, weird records that sounded nothing like Queen, Led Zeppelin, and all the stuff that was being shoved at us. And that's kind of what started opening my head up about this other world that was out there. And the records were strange, and they were compelling, and they were funny. And I loved that.
Speaking of funny, you're really, really good friends with Johnny Lydon.
Oh, yeah. Awesome. We're like old mates.
Now, how did you...
Very unlikely.
Yeah, how'd that happen?
Well, there was a time around I'm trying to think, it was probably 97 or so. After Punk Diary had been out a while, I had this thought of turning it into a little daily radio show, a little, this day in punk rock history, what happened. And there was a company that was very interested in doing it. They came at me and said, well, yeah, we really want to do this, but what if we had a celebrity, host for it instead of you? And it's like, well, depends on who you want it to be. And I thought they were going to, say one of these East or West Coast alternative disc jockeys, which I would have, not done. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, we've got a friend that knows John Lydon. How about him? And I went, oh my God, if John wants to be the host, my ego goes to one side, and I will absolutely do that in a heartbeat. So they set up a meeting. I came out to LA. I'd seen a picture of John in a Dallas Stars hockey jersey. And it was a white jersey with an enormous star on it, and it just said Stars. And so I had a friend that worked for the team, and I got that exact same jersey, and I wore it to the meeting. And so we get into an elevator together. He doesn't know that's me. And he sees the jersey, and he just says, oh, nice shirt. And I went, oh, this? I don't know who it's for. I just wore it because I was going to suck up to you. And he just thought that was the funniest thing in the world. And then we go into this meeting together. He's kind of like, oh, you're the guy. So it turns out he had bought a copy of Punk Diary and had just consumed it. He loved it because he said, I got everything right. Everything that was in there about him was 100% on the button true. And it wasn't filled with a lot of waffly speculation about his motivations. It was just facts, date, figures, get it right. And he loved that. And so I treated him like I treat a lot of people that I deal with. Very honestly, I don't go fanboy on him. And he liked that reality because he deals with a lot of people that they're wanting to be with him because they want something. And I didn't want anything. If he said something cutting towards me, I gave it right back to him in full measure, which he thought was very funny because people don't talk to him like that because they're intimidated by him because he can be intimidating.
Sure.
But
sure.
I didn't care. So we become, over 20 years now, we become good friends. And I see him every time he comes through town now. And in fact, I've got a project that I want to work with him on. He's got some family issues he's dealing with. And as soon as we're past all that, we're going to probably end up doing another project.
What about that footage? I don't know if you want to talk about it, but I know you have footage that you rediscovered in your last move.
Oh, yeah. When we were working on our television show with VH1, they sent John we had this notion of John's got to be a political reporter and he's got to go to the conventions and give us his take on it. So he was sent to the Democratic convention, he was sent to the Republican and the Reform convention. So he was talking to people at the conventions and standing around outside and people who worked at him and protesters. And he was just being himself. The sad part is that VH1 didn't want to spend the budget to send me with him. Oh. So I wasn't just his pal, I was his writer, and I was writing a lot for him because he would have an opportunity. He would be, we would be set up to where you were going to be somewhere. And I would say, oh man, I know this little thing about that person that if you present it this way, you're going to get a reaction. And so I was able to fill in some quick details on the spot.
You're great. You're like, I just want to interject. You're like a writer / director / producer of all these segments that you guys got to work on.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly. And it's really funny because he was so great to work with because John's not a comic. He's a naturally funny guy, but he's not a comedian. And so we could have a line and would say, okay, well, here's basically the line, and then he would do it, and he would kind of turn it into more rottenish. Then I would basically do an impersonation of him saying the line to give it the best timing and punch, and then he would deliver it the next time exactly that, and he would be his best self, like a producer. Since we had this great respect, I was not making fun of him, because sometimes people would go, man, I can't believe you're doing an impersonation of him to his face. And he says, yeah, but he knows that I'm looking out for him. And if we do it this way and it works, we're out of here faster. Because he's, he doesn't want to stand around all day cutting lines. He wants to get it done.
I've never met him, obviously, but I would think he's a bit impatient at times. He seems to have that sort of personality.
It depends on if you're buying the beer.
So this was the year 2000 that you were getting this footage together, going to these different conventions?
Oh, Johnny Rotten meeting John Kasich or Newt Gingrich, or, it's just looking over this footage now after 20 years, it was pretty funny seeing it. Because, frankly, a lot of the things that were being talked about in those conventions, the same issues, largely. Same issues. The poles have drifted apart. I mean, this side's gone that way, and the other side's gone the other way. But pretty much the same stuff.
It's ironic, isn't it? We just kind of don't fix anything.
Well, and I'm a bit of a history fan, so I mean, I've got a lot of American history books and what have you. There was a time back in the 80s when the libraries were getting ready to get rid of actual physical newspapers that they had on file, and they were converting it all to microfiche, which was a terrible format. Bad idea.
I hated that stuff. That was such a pain in the ass to navigate.
They're horrible. They're just horrible low-res images of reality. So they were tossing out these big bound volumes of old newspapers, and I had a friend that bought a whole bunch of them, and he said, "Hey, you want any of these? Come on over, I'll sell them to you cheap." And so for about $2 a piece, I was able to buy old newspapers. And so I bought a big stack of them that appealed to me. I've got about a six-inch high stack of them. So I have original, actual newspapers, and the most recent ones that I bought were from the 1870s. And the oldest ones I bought were from about 1790.
Wow.
So you can actually hold a newspaper, from Philadelphia that has on the front page a letter to the editor from Thomas Jefferson, who's really pissed off at an editorial that was in the newspaper. And I think that's just fascinating stuff. And here again, you read these newspapers back then, and for all the talk of a biased press these days, oh, God, you should have seen the press in the 1800, 1810. Oh, my God, they might as well have been party pamphlets. It was so incredibly biased.
I've heard that, but I mean, I've never researched it myself. I've just heard it in passing. How bad was it? Like, one paper would be Fox, one paper would be CNN?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was totally the way it was. So that was when the founders are writing for freedom of the press. That was the reality. Freedom of the press was not a news that presented everything fairly. It was, you could get your news from wherever you want. And then everything kind of mellowed out and started playing nice, through the 20th century. And now the press has basically kind of drifted back to where it was at the beginning of the 19th century.
So we're just coming back up on a same cycle.
Yeah, we're back to where we were. Next thing you know, time for a constitutional convention. Full circle.
Yeah, who knows what's going to happen next? Things are getting kind of cray.
It always seems that way. But if I would just give you an ordinary newspaper, just an ordinary day from 1948, you'd be reading articles about immigration and somebody killing their family and concerns about the Chinese. And it's going to seem really, really familiar, a lot of it. We all think we live in unique times, and in some regards we do, but it's a lot of us. It's the human condition, I think.
Yeah, so we should just turn off all the news and stop reading all that garbage and listen to more music and comedy, basically.
Well, this is one of the reasons I love comedy. Comedy is a great elixir. Comedy can be mental sandpaper. It will knock the rough edges off your day quickly. And there are people who enjoy the adrenaline rush of getting made crazy by a news story or an upset that is generated by the press or online or what have you. There are people out there who want attention, and they get attention by throwing a tantrum, deserved or not. They make a big fuss, and they wind people up, and that's their power. And there are people who have gotten wound up so much, they start to crave that adrenaline rush from it. So then they want more and more and more and more of it, and it makes people unhappy. And the quick way to undo that is with comedy. Comedy gives you a similar rush, but in a totally opposite direction. Sometimes I will declare a day or two where it's just like, not turning on the news all day. It's not going to miss me.
I'm a firm believer in doing that. I don't watch the news. I don't watch a lot of television. I've noticed my mom and her husband, they leave MSNBC on all day from like 7 a.m. in the morning until they go to bed. And I think a lot of people do that.
It's just feeding that aggravation, you know, all the time.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, I'm not really listening to it. Yeah, but your subconscious is.
Totally. And you've got it blaring all over the house, and it's going to get into your psyche, and it permeates everything you think subconsciously, and you're angry.
And it will wind you up, and it will impact your health, ultimately.
Totally.
I mean, that is a thing. It's a total thing.
It's so sad.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why you need to go home and start doing sets at home.
Mom, I wrote a new dick joke. Listen.
Okay, maybe that was a bad idea.
Yeah. So what's coming next? What are you working on?
Oh, I've always got 18 projects going at any given time. I've got somebody who wants me to read a novel to do an audiobook, which I've never done before. I've got another new potential channel that's in the kind of secret phase. It's something that hasn't been done yet, which is what I tend to do. Mm-hmm. And I've just launched the new national channel, Comedy, on radio.com, which is the Intercom, free app. They basically have taken what I was doing with the AM and FM radio stations, that 24-hour comedy thing, and they put it on an app. And now that's winding up, or it's out there and it's reaching its fulfillment. I'm looking for the next format to throw at them, and they're going, what else have you got? What else have you got? What else have you got? So we've already got the next one in development. And let's see, what else? I've got a weird record project I'm working on there's a company that is wanting to lease a couple of masters from me for some 1960s pornos that I've discovered the soundtracks to these films. The films are lost, completely lost. Huh. But I have the soundtracks, which are kind of these weird little jazz soundtracks. There was a filmmaker named Whit Boyd who operated out of Dallas in the 60s and 70s, was constantly getting arrested, made these real low-budget pornos. And he used this recording studio, Sellers Recording Studio in downtown Dallas. And they put a little combo in there, and you could hear the studio slates on these recordings. I have a suspicion it might be Whit Boyd himself. You'll hear him on the talkback speaker, and he'll say something like, 5 minutes. He'll say 5 minutes of lively music, sex scene on the lake with monster.
With monster?
And just kind of go, okay. And then the band would play for 5 minutes. And then he would cut in again and said, okay, that's enough. 3 minutes, petting scene in coffin. And then they would play for 3 minutes. They would just kind of make something up and play it for 3 minutes. And so we don't know what the movie is, but he gives these little descriptors all along the tape, which kind of makes you go, God, this sounds like a really weird movie.
Wouldn't it be fun to find that movie? I love what you're going to do with that project. That sounds interesting, like improv jazz for porn with some kind of monster coffin kind of action. That's a weird fetish, by the way. I ain't going to judge. But
it's very bizarre. I didn't write it, Lisa. I didn't write it. I just found the tapes.
Wouldn't it be fun to find that footage?
There are people looking, because nobody knew these titles existed until I came up with them. And now there's a girl who's very interested by this stuff. She's the one that actually put me together with the record company. And she's out there looking for Sex Monster and Party Girl.
Sweet.
What a double bill for the drive-in.
Now, how do you come into this? You're like one of those cool people who just kind of shows up in the spot where you're supposed to be at the time before it's going to happen for mainstream. That's who you are.
Yeah, well, you hear about these people that, I was at the flea market and I found a box and look at there, it's the master tapes from Led Zeppelin 2. That sort of thing. That happens to me about every 2 years, and it has for ages. So, I discovered a whole bunch of recordings of Glenn Campbell when he was cutting demos, when he was still trying to make it. He worked as a session musician out in L.A., and he was hired by some songwriters who were writing songs for Elvis. This is when Elvis was doing his movies. And so they would write these songs that they were pitching to Elvis to record, because there was a lot of money to be made if Elvis sang one of your songs. And they hired these session guys, and Glenn Campbell was one of them. And Glenn would do the lead vocals because he could do a pretty passable Elvis Presley. So I found all these 400 demos at this guy's estate sale, and a lot of them had Glenn Campbell doing the lead vocals. So I went through the right channels, and they were released last year by Universal as, I think it's called Glenn Campbell Sings for the King. And I provided, I think, 8 masters for the 16-track release. And it's fun stuff. It's fun stuff. But how unlikely is that to find at an estate sale for $1 a piece?
Only you.
These masters. Yeah, these masters. And then a couple of years prior to that, I discovered in a storage locker, there was a big bunch of records. And among them, I found masters to about an hour's worth of live Hank Williams.
Wow.
That nobody even knew existed, and it's Hank Williams in 1950 when he's still on the ascent, and went through the right channels, went through the family, got them released on a tremendous little bit of vinyl called the Garden Spot, with fabulous mastering, and the thing ended up winning a Grammy.
Oh, congrats.
Kind of like, so yeah, it was a weird thing. I mean, I was just tickled that the record came out, but to have a Grammy attached to it as well, it's like, well, that's nice.
That's super
so I'm
lucky
always
and
looking
awesome.
for the next thing. What's going to be the next thing? Because I find lost masters like that frequently.
Have you always been like this? Gonna sound really weird, but have you been like this since you were a kid?
I've been a collector. I find out about things that I would collect, and of course I've collected music since the 70s, so I always like to find something and then find the story behind the thing, find out how did it become, how did it not become. And there are people when they collect records, and I'm a pretty serious record collector. I mean, I'm at about 60,000 records at my house.
Shazam!
It's an affliction. And there are people who collect genres or to collect an artist, or I have 2 little things that I dearly love to collect that are weird, that are just odd things. One is I collect first records by well-known singers or bands. Their very first record that nobody ever heard of. I love those. The failed record. So before the Byrds were the Byrds, they made a record as the Beefeaters, and it didn't go anywhere. Before Barry Manilow was Barry Manilow, he put out a record under the name Featherbed. And what's funny is the song he recorded as Featherbed, one of them, is the song that he ended up having a #1 hit with. But he did it as a disco song instead of a ballad, so it was like, yeah, it didn't work. Or, Creedence Clearwater Revival recorded under the name of the Gollywogs. Or Tom Fogerty and the Blue Velvets, that's also Creedence. So I love finding those little gems, because they're, Lou Reed's first record wasn't the Velvet Underground. It was a doo-wop group called the Jades in 1959. That's Lou Reed. I mean, what a weird thing to find on a record.
That's wild.
And then the other odd, which is kind of hand in glove with that, is I love first versions of hit songs before they were a hit. So the first time a song goes from the songwriter to a record, but it doesn't work for some reason. And a song is kind of like a 3-legged stool. You need to have a label that can really get it into the marketplace. You need to have a good recording of it, a good performance and recording, and then you need to have proper promotion. And if you have it on a good label and a good performance, but nobody knows about the record, it doesn't make it. So you can have records that some of them are terrible. I mean, the very first version of Twist and Shout was not the Beatles, was not the Isley Brothers. It was before that, and done by a group called the Top Notes. It was on Atlantic Records. Good label. Phil Spector produced it. My God, great producer. The performance is okay, but Phil, for some reason, had the band do that song, Twist and Shout, as a cha-cha. It didn't work. It's not a cha-cha, it's a twist record, for crying out loud. So the record failed. And if you heard it now, it would be one of those things where you'd kind of go, wait a minute. This song is kind of familiar. Oh, God, what is this? You wouldn't even recognize it as Twist and Shout because it's just such a terrible recording. And there's so many others like that. One of the ones that really astounded me a few years back was when Pearl Jam released I'm trying to think what album it was. They had one of their songs turned up on a Pearl Jam album, some time ago, and I was kind of going, wait a minute, that song is really, really familiar. And it turned out that I had been given a cassette of that song 15 years earlier when Eddie Vedder was in a band called Bad Radio. And he was doing the song back then. Before he joined Pearl Jam, he brought the song with him. And when I listened to the song, Better Man, by the way, and when you hear Better Man by Pearl Jam, it's not that much different from Eddie's garage band recording in 1987. But it took almost 15 years for him to put that thing out again and for it to hit. And it's like, oh, well, that's, of course, Better Man. That's a natural hit. It's like, geez, yeah.
It just took a decade and a half.
So I love sometimes the long burn on the fuse where a songwriter just is persistent with a song. If it's a good song, it's going to happen eventually, hopefully. And one of the most persistent stories, strangely enough, is the Carpenters song Close to You, which is this syrupy little ballad. The Carpenters, oh, wow, of course it was going to be a hit. The Carpenters recorded it. Well, the songwriter who wrote that kept trying again and again and again and again to turn that song into a hit because he believed in it. And there are probably a dozen people who recorded it before the Carpenters, and they all failed with it. The song was like the kiss of death. It would just not hit. I mean, even Dionne Warwick did a version of Close to You, and it didn't work until the Carpenters did it. It's just capturing the magic. They finally captured the magic of that song.
Maybe that's why Karen Carpenter died. It was a cursed song.
No, they had to hit with it. But one thing weird in the Carpenters world, I know we're far from being activists at this point. I actually heard at a garage sale the very first Carpenters album showed up, which I'd never even seen before. It's called Offering, and on the front cover, I swear to death, Karen Carpenter looks like she's dressed as a nun. She's not, but she sort of kind of looks like she's dressed as a nun. And I'd never really heard that album before, and I listened to it, and it sounded nothing. Half of the album was nothing like the Carpenters because for the greater part of the album, Richard is taking the lead vocal. And the Carpenters were all about Karen on the lead and Richard in harmony. And I wonder, it's just in the back of my head, is that what ultimately led to, Karen had an emotional beatdown by her dad. I mean, that's kind of led to a lot of her problems, her disorders. Yeah. And there was a problem with Richard as well. And I'm wondering if that was part of the turning point, is when Richard realized that the record label was pushing her to the front and him back.
Yeah, sibling rivalry ain't nothing to play with.
Yeah, it happens.
Yeah.
It happens. So I realize we're very far from the normal stream of your show at this point. We have wandered down a rabbit hole within a rabbit hole, Lisa.
I'm loving this rabbit hole. You're going to have great stories. If there's ever a zombie apocalypse, they're going to put you next to the fireplace and just, you're good to go.
Let me tell you about a telephone that you had to dial. What's a dial?
It's weird you said rabbit hole. I was in the rabbit hole last night. I was on YouTube and I was checking out Brazilian psychedelic music from the 60s and 70s. Oh my gosh, I had my mind blown because I saw or heard all this great music. These videos there was a lot of exciting stuff going on. There's a lot of exciting world music that we don't really listen to in our country.
Well, that's funny because you'll hear the culturally minded public service radio station talking about, we're going to do a world music hour. And it's always somebody who's wearing feathers and brightly colored clothes doing things that are probably sung in Spanish. There's a lot more world music than that. There was, like you said, there's the psychedelic music scene that was happening in South America, which is pretty robust, 67 to 70. There was a lot of stuff. Did you know there's also a psych music scene at the same time in Turkey?
Nope.
Very weird.
Nope.
Yeah, bands doing their own thing in Turkish. It's cool stuff. To me, world music. Why don't we hear some of that world music on PBS?
I would really dig that.
And then the stuff, the world music that I really enjoy, it's a rabbit hole I fell into years ago when I first started getting into reggae, which was, back when you could actually still go see Bob Marley. I like to trace things back. Oh, well, that's really cool. Where did that come from? I mean, that tends to be the way I think about a lot of stuff. And so I went to reggae music, and then I went backwards, and I fell into blue beat, and then that got me back into ska. And I was getting into ska about the time that there was a ska revival with groups like the Specials and the Selector and Madness. And then I went back one more step, and I was in the world of calypso. And calypso music was coming out of the Caribbean in the 50s. And it's really interesting because calypso singers were kind of like rap musicians in the Caribbean in the 50s. They would take whatever going on around them in the news, and they would kind of do these songs that were in kind of loose rhyme to this calypso beat, talking about whatever's in the news. And it could be talking about Khrushchev or Kennedy or, what have you. British politics figured into calypso songs because they were still British colonies at the time.
Aren't we all?
So, to me, here again, calypso, great world music. In fact, here's a little known fact. Did you know that in 1953, 54, 55, back then, Louis Farrakhan started out as a calypso singer. That was going to be what made him famous.
Are you kidding me? I had no idea.
He performed under the name The Charmer. And you can find these tracks on YouTube. I discovered these tracks, and I was fascinated by the story. Found out that the songs had never been registered for copyright. The performances had never been registered. They were all public domain. And so I got together with a company years ago, and we released a CD of all the Charmer recordings, the Louis Farrakhan recordings. And it came and went kind of quickly, but we put all that stuff back into print, which is now you can find a lot of them on YouTube. The most fantastic ones is he's got a song called Is You Is or Is You Ain't, which is a song written about Christine Jorgensen, one of the first transsexuals. And so here's Louis Farrakhan singing about a transsexual in 1954. Well, isn't that topical? So it came to pass that Louis Farrakhan could not, as the Charmer, get much attention outside of his own city because Harry Belafonte was sucking all the oxygen out of the room. As Louis Farrakhan said, it seemed that there was room for only one new black calypso singer, and he was it. There's no room for me.
That's fair. I don't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry. Please forgive me because I think you're a genius. I don't mean to cut you off, but it does occur to me there's a lot of that in entertainment. There can be one black dude who's really funny at a time. There can be one woman who's funny who's a brunette. There can be one black woman who's funny. It's changed, but only recently. Am I right or wrong with that?
No, there's something to that. It's kind of like, okay, and it's kind of not even who's first there. It's who got there with the best publicist.
Exactly. But it's shifted now, yeah? Like now one would think, you turn on whatever platform you're listening or streaming to, and you don't see that just one calypso singer anymore. You might have other variations, other very talented people doing different takes on being the same kind of person, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. No, total sense. I mean, back in the day when Charlie Pride came out, okay, he's the black country singer.
Right, we got one. We don't need no more.
We got one. Don't need any more. So Otis Williams, who is also a black country singer, who is also really good, nobody's ever heard of him. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like, well, what about Otis? No, we got Charlie Pride. Thank you. Next.
But, wow. So if Farrakhan had if he had a better publicist and he had better exposure at the time and we were more open-minded as a society, he might not have gone into the ministry.
Well, yeah, and isn't that those weird little crossroad moments in histories? Because Farrakhan was really getting upset, and he got targeted to join the Nation of Islam. They brought him in because he was charismatic, he was an entertainer,
he was a charmer,
he knew how to handle a crowd on a stage, he's a performer. And so they brought him in, and he adapted himself to this new role. And there's the crossroads. What would have happened to the Nation of Islam had not Farrakhan had been at the fore? It could have been a very different organization because he's quite the maker of policy in that world.
Wow. That's kind of mind-blowing.
If only we had paid attention to his his song about Christine Jorgensen.
Right? It's like somebody should have bought Hitler's artwork and let him go to school. I'm not trying to compare Farrakhan to Hitler by any stretch. I'm just saying it's the same kind of, and like that sounds really effed up. But, the idea of somebody's pursuing a dream and you have to get turned away and you're a little bitter and now you're going to put your talents to different uses.
That's right. That's right. I mean, the world of sushi is so lost without your talents that you turned away from the world of sushi when you were 16, Lisa. And I know you don't like to talk about it, but it could have been uni, could have been something that everybody eats every day.
Every
like
day.
French fries.
Every day. Kids would be taking it to school on ice.
Could have been.
Could have happened.
But you failed at the crossroads. You took the other turn.
So there's so many, I'm sure they're going to come to your mind. What is a band or a musician where you heard that original album that first time they got their nod and you can't believe it didn't go somewhere huge?
Oh, that it failed?
Yeah, I'm sure that happens a lot. But like one particular artist or band of artists that you just think, how did that not just completely blow up and go global?
There was a little band that I ran into on the street in London on one of my many trips. It was a band called Scarlet Party. This would have been in, I think, 82. And I thought they were really good. They were a little pop band. And they invited me to, come to the rehearsal space. And I was convinced, oh, man, these guys are really good. They got signed to EMI. They cut a couple singles, one of which did okay. The next one was a bad choice because it was a ballad. They shouldn't have led with a ballad. And then they recorded an entire album. By that time, EMI was so smitten with another band that they had signed called Duran Duran that they totally kind of let Scarlet Party kind of go to weeds and didn't even issue the LP. And the band's dreams just kind of withered and died. And I always hated that because they had given me a cassette of the album and it was glorious. It was an absolutely fabulous pop album. And the band didn't happen. So their only artifact of them are these 245s, one of which is called 101 Damnations. And at the time, part of the pushback on the lead singer, a guy named Graham Dye, was that he sounded a little too much like John Lennon. And this is about 2 years after Lennon's been killed. And it's like, is sounding like John Lennon a bad thing now? I mean, really? Seriously?
That's
frankly,
awful.
His records were great. So that was one of those, if only. They should have made it. They should have made it.
Scarlet Party, huh? Can we find that anywhere? Do they have any clips on YouTube?
It's up on YouTube. It's up on YouTube. Scarlet Party. So, I mean, that's one band that I really, really like. I always thought the band XTC should have been bigger than they were. I always thought Elvis Costello should have had far more hits than he did. It's strange to think somebody like Elvis Costello, who's probably put out like 40 albums and still tours, is probably considered a niche artist. But I guess he is.
Yeah, he never really went mainstream. Super talented. I think everybody in America probably knows at least how to hum along with one song, even if they don't know the lyrics,
And he also had the courage on frequently to do an album in a totally different direction.
Mm-hmm.
I want to do this one with a brass band from Louisiana. Well, okay, let's do that. And I love that courage. I love that courage, to where you don't have to be, it takes no courage to be the B-52s. Love the B-52s. It doesn't take any courage because every record sounds basically like the record that came before.
Sure.
And the Ramones did the same thing, fine. Boston did the same thing. Led Zeppelin did the same thing. There's no courage in that. David Bowie, on the other hand, frequently completely changed everything and actually had a couple of massive failures. Even in the early 90s when he did Tin Machine, what an enormous turd in the punch bowl that was. But it was David Bowie. So what did he do? Just reinvented himself and went and did something else.
Sure. And he was forgiven.
I love that courage.
Yeah, because he's David Bowie. But, it does take courage to step outside of what your fans expect and what you've done before. Yes. And people will turn on you sometimes.
Right. It's interesting right now, watching the controversy over the brand new Dave Chappelle special that's just dropped on Netflix, Sticks and Stones, aptly named, where he's having the courage to talk about a lot of stuff in the same way that we talk about it in private. He's doing it on stage, and people are getting very upset. Oh my God, he's making fun of, this, that, and the other, and it's mostly the people who are getting bent out of shape are people, is jokes about sexual orientation and what have you. And he's just saying stuff that's in mainstream conversation, and he's doing what comics do. He's putting it on stage and having fun with it, knocking it about like we do, except in a much more clever way than normal people would. He's not being safe. He's not, because Dave Chappelle could be safe. He could get out there and get his $20 million from Netflix for a special being safe and just telling hood stories.
Sure.
But,
and it would be brilliant too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he's done that. But now he's doing this other thing. And I love the courage. I love the courage to do something like that. And especially if you have the courage and do it, and you do it well.
And there's no malice. He's not malicious with this. So I don't know. I think we're getting too soft as a society. I think everybody needs to be recognized and respected. Obviously, nobody should be targeted for violence or harassment, or losing their jobs because they're this or they're that, or getting kicked out of where they live because they're gay, or things like that happen. But at the same time, there shouldn't be a limit on what artists want to express, especially when it's not done with hatred. That's kind of the way I feel, because we kind of come closer together if we are able to laugh at these things that are painful. No? Isn't that the whole point of comedy?
And sometimes, in comedy, sometimes you have to wear the hat of the other party in order to make a point. Like, so in my comedy world, my comedy broadcast world, there are places where, since I'm in AM and FM radio stations and what have you, places that I can't go because of the FCC. Fine. But there are also places I can't go just because sometimes it makes people a little too uncomfortable. And it's funny because we get, and I'm sure you've run into these people who get offended on behalf of somebody else.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
They're typically white people in their early 20s or their 50s and 60s. That's been my experience.
Right. So when it comes up generally with me, is if I have a comic that would dare utter the word fag on the air, and it's allowed in my world under two ways. One is, if a gay comedian wants to use that word, fine, go for it. I don't care. Well, actually, I don't care anyway, but I don't care. And the other one, if somebody is making fun of somebody who's intolerant, if Ron White says, is talking about a guy wearing a hat getting stopped in a bar because he's wearing a hat, and he says, this guy at the bar says, well, only people who wear that hat are fags, Well, Ron is illustrating an intolerant person.
Right. Obviously, you're making fun of somebody who is stunted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that should be okay. If he was making that remark from his heart, that's a totally different thing.
Yeah, it's hateful.
Right. Well, so there's these red flags that whenever one of those bits comes up, some listener will write in nastygram, and I'll have to say, well, I'm sorry you didn't appreciate the joke from KT Tatara, but perhaps you should check out his other stuff. And he frequently appears at Pride festivals or wherever he happens to appear, because it's okay. Don't get upset. He said it. It's fine. It was okay. It's comedy. And yeah, we need to just recognize it's all in fun. It's all part of the process. And if we can't call out things by their proper names, then we don't have clarity. We need clarity.
We need clarity. We need humor. I don't know. To me personally, for me, I don't know why people don't have a. I don't know. I think there's other topics out there that are a lot more egregious than an occasional word like fag or dyke or. I don't like the N-word personally. That bothers me greatly. I don't like the N-word. I don't use it in conversation. But I grew up in the Deep South, and if my daddy had ever heard me say that word, I would have got my mouth washed out with soap. See,
now there's a difference between your generation and my generation, even though, we're probably only, 10 or 15 years apart, is that was a common word in my world growing up in the South in the 60s, but it wasn't used necessarily as a malicious or hateful word. It was used as both. In fact, there was a barbecue restaurant in Fort Worth that existed even up into the early 70s that was Big N's Barbecue, and it was run by a black family. And they were still in business under that name in 72, 73, 74. It's a very different world.
Yeah, very, very different. I think that's why my dad had such a visceral response to that word, because he grew up in a time where people used it in a very negative context, and he didn't want us growing up with that word in our mouth. So, we all have things that we respond to negatively. We all have triggers when we're hearing things. I don't like the cancel culture over words. It bothers me. Actions, yeah. If somebody's doing a whole bunch of baby raping jokes and then you find out they're actually a pedo who's raping kids, that's a different situation than somebody who, tweeted out some bullshit or said a word that you don't like. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah, First Amendment rights and all.
It is. And, we have to remember, we've got that here because in Canada, I don't know, are they still going after comics for making fun of people in Canada? Is that still illegal and prosecuted in Canada?
I don't know, but I know it's happening, from what I understand, in England, or whatever they're called now. Are they the United Kingdom? Are they Britain? Are they England? I don't know. Are they getting rebranded?
They're keeping their money, I think. That should have been the whole Brexit tell, which I never understood why people actually thought that they were going to stay in the EU, because they never gave up the pound. And I think that was the biggest tell of all.
Yeah, it's like when you get married and y'all don't join finances. This ain't going to last.
Exactly. Well, that sounded like a personal experience there, Lisa.
What's mine is mine, and what's yours is never going to be mine. So just help yourself to my stuff.
Exactly. Wow.
Anything else? Any kind of amazing knowledge you would like to drop on my listeners and me?
Oh, I have no idea. It's always something. I'm standing in a room full of records that I'm selling, trying to figure out what box am I going to list next. Should it be doo-wop, or should it be 60s soul, or garage records, or 70s, or some of these new wave records that I haven't listed yet?
I would get rid of the doo-wop personally. I think doo-wop caused Vietnam.
Okay, are we being funny?
No, I really kind of do, because I find that genre of music extremely annoying, and I think it did things to that generation where they were like, okay, I'm getting shipped off against my will, but I've got this inner anger. I can't quite place where it's from, and I think it's all that doo-wop they listened to as teenagers.
Wow, I've never heard that. Do you know that doo-wop was the first interracial rock and roll?
Well, I applaud that, because I'm very much into integration, but I still don't like what they did with it. I can't listen to it. I really don't like it. I don't know. Maybe from a past life. Maybe I had some horrible experience. Maybe I was killed while some band was playing doo-wop music.
Did some bad man touch your Rama?
Yeah, and there was a lot of finger snapping at the same time, and yeah.
Okay, well, maybe I've got 2 boxes of doo-wop records here that I've got to see if there's anybody left alive who remembers who the accents or the velours are. So that is the problem with it. There's this, with record, there's all these people talking about, we're going to collect records now. It's kind of like, okay, well, welcome to the club. For all of us who've been here for ages, there's this bell curve of value for records. And generally speaking, records ascend in value, they peak, and then they sink. And right now, at the top of the bell curve of value right now is primarily 70s records, 70s rock and roll, and 60s soul records, a particular kind of 60s soul records. And on the falling edge, stuff that is getting to be worth less and less every day is Elvis Presley, doo-wop, 50s R&B, big band records they're down below the basement right now, and it's like nobody cares. And the other astounding little subcurve are record store day records, where they put out the new vinyl release, and they put out a limited edition. They sell it to you for $35, and it's worth $35 when it's sold. And then as soon as somebody opens it up and plays it, that record overnight is worth $15. It's
Yep.
lost half its value. And the question is, 10 years from now, what is the value of that record? Does anybody care about the 10-year-old album from Tennis or some other band of the moment, Bell and Sebastian? Is anybody going to care? We don't know. We just don't know, because we're into uncharted territory with people who are buying vinyl for the first time. I'm glad to see that some sort of permanent music format is actually happening, and that people are excited about music because of the music, the art, having that visceral thing in your hand, because I love that. Because I always mourned when everything went to MP3s, because in our generations, music was passed down from parent to child, and sometimes from grandparent to grandchild. Music was handed down because we would find our parents, old records, and what's this about? I grew up with this, and I can play it when they're not around, and what have you. And you ended up having this discovery of music from a generation prior to yours, maybe 2 generations prior to yours, and it made you a better, more rounded person. I'm sounding real scholarly here. In the days of MP3s, music is not, a lot of times, is not played, shall we say, publicly.
No, it's your earbuds.
It's played personally. Okay, so that means you're not sharing. You're just having a one-on-one experience. And you could lose, in the days before the cloud, you could potentially lost your entire library with losing a device, which was tragic. But in the MP3 world, even with cloud storage, 30 years from now, 50 years from now, will anybody, when they're cleaning out the grandparents' house, find a shoebox full of their MP3s? No, it's not going to happen.
No.
Will they go to a garage sale and buy MP3s for a penny a piece so they could actually explore music beyond their ken at virtually no cost, like you could with records? No, it's not going to happen. So it is stifling music experience going to MP3. It makes it personal. The record companies have a tighter control over the ownership of that song, and maybe that's what it's all about. Maybe that's what it is. And you can't share it as readily. You can't pass it down as readily. And you can't experience and explore as easily. And if they control that secondhand market, to where they basically eliminate the secondhand market, then musicians will have much shorter careers, and their memory will be much diminished. Nobody's going to remember a musician that's from 50 years earlier at all, because that secondary market won't be there to remember him. Music has this power of transcending generations, and however you can do it, however you can encourage it happening within your own family, within your circle of friends, do so, because music is, it's the soundtrack to our lives. And make sure you toss some comedy in there too, because sometimes music can be a little too serious.
Thank you so much, George Gimarc. I think the world of that dude. I love him. Thanks, y'all, for listening. Please join me at lisalandry.com. I have a YouTube channel. If you sign up there, you will know when every new podcast drops. Each woman is Wednesday. I also have a brand new blog. If you're going to check it out for the first time, start at the first entry. That's how it works. It's Lesbianage. She was straight up undercover. And you can find that on my website, or you can also find it at lesbianage.com, which is actually kind of spelled lesbian age. Shout out Ari. I love you so much. I would love to make some music with you.